The rain hammered against the windows of the small coastal diner as Admiral Jake Morrison sat alone in the corner booth, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. At 52, he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had commanded respect in the most dangerous corners of the world. His steel-gray eyes held stories that would never be told, secrets that were buried deeper than the ocean trenches his teams had once navigated. The diner was nearly empty at this late hour, save for a tired waitress and a trucker who dozed over his pie. Jake preferred it this way. After 30 years in the Navy SEALs, the last 10 as an admiral, he had grown accustomed to solitude. It was safer that way, for everyone involved. The bell above the door chimed softly as someone entered, bringing with them a gust of cold air and the sound of rain. Jake didn't look up immediately, his training making him aware of every movement, every sound, without appearing to pay attention. The newcomer moved with purpose, their footsteps measured and controlled. When Jake finally raised his eyes, he found himself looking at a woman unlike any he had encountered in his years of service. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with dark hair that framed a face marked by both beauty and something harder to define. There was a quality about her that Jake recognized immediately, the careful way she surveyed the room, the controlled breathing, the slight tension in her shoulders. She was military, or had been. But there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The woman chose a booth across the diner, positioning herself where she could see both the entrance and the back exit. Professional habits, Jake noted. She ordered coffee from the waitress, her voice soft but carrying an accent he couldn't quite place. Eastern European, perhaps, but filtered through years of careful training. Jake found himself studying her more intently than he should have. In his line of work, paranoia was a survival skill, but this felt different. There was something familiar about her, though he was certain they had never met. She had the bearing of someone who had seen combat, the kind of controlled stillness that came from facing death and surviving. 20 minutes passed in silence, both of them nursing their coffee and pretending not to notice the other. The trucker paid his bill and left, the bell chiming his departure. The waitress disappeared into the back, leaving Jake and the mysterious woman alone in the main dining area. It was then that she stood and walked directly to his table. "Admiral Morrison," she said, sliding into the seat across from him without invitation. Her English was perfect, but there was still that hint of something else beneath it. "We need to talk." Jake's hand instinctively moved toward the concealed weapon at his hip, a movement so subtle that most people wouldn't have noticed. But she caught it, and a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I'm not armed," she said quietly. "And if I wanted you dead, we wouldn't be having this conversation." "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice carrying the authority of command. Instead of answering, she reached into her jacket pocket. Jake tensed, but she moved slowly, deliberately, pulling out a small photograph. She placed it on the table between them, face down. "Before you look at that," she said, "I need you to understand something. What I'm about to show you will change everything you think you know about Operation Silent Thunder." Jake's blood ran cold. Operation Silent Thunder was classified at levels that barely existed. It had been a joint mission 5 years ago, one that officially never happened. A mission that had cost lives and left scars that still hadn't healed. Only a handful of people knew the details, and all of them were either dead or sworn to secrecy. "That operation is classified," he said carefully. "Yes, it is," she agreed. "But classification doesn't erase the past. It doesn't bring back the dead, and it doesn't heal the wounded." She gestured to the photograph. "Turn it over." Jake hesitated for a moment, then flipped the photo. The image hit him like a physical blow. It was a surveillance photo, grainy and dark, but clear enough to show a young woman in tactical gear. She was carrying an unconscious child, running through what looked like a bombed-out building. Blood covered her face and arms, but she pressed on, determination etched in every line of her body. But it wasn't just any woman. Jake recognized the setting, the uniforms of the soldiers in the background. This was from Silent Thunder, from the night everything went wrong. The night when their carefully planned extraction turned into a nightmare of betrayal and bloodshed. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. "I was there," she said simply. Jake looked up from the photograph to study her face more carefully. The bone structure, the eyes, the way she held herself. 5 years had passed, 5 years of trying to forget that night. But, now, looking at her, the memories came flooding back with painful clarity. "You're supposed to be dead," he said. "So are you, according to the official reports." Jake remembered now. There had been a woman on their target list that night, a high-value asset that Intel had marked as hostile. But, when they reached the compound, everything had gone sideways. The supposed weapons cache turned out to be a safe house for refugees, mostly women and children fleeing a civil war that had torn their country apart. The woman sitting across from him had been there, but not as an enemy combatant. She had been one of the protectors, someone trying to get innocent people to safety. In the chaos that followed, when enemy forces surrounded the compound and the situation turned into a running battle, she had disappeared into the smoke and darkness. The official report listed her as killed in action, another casualty in a mission that had too many. But Jake had always wondered. He had seen her fighting that night, not against his team, but alongside them, protecting the civilians they were all trying to save. "Elena Volkov," she said, finally, giving him a name. "And, yes, Admiral, I remember you too. You were the one who gave the order to change the mission parameters when you realized what was really happening." Jake nodded slowly. It had been one of the hardest decisions of his career. The original mission had been based on faulty intelligence, and, when they discovered the truth, he had to choose between following orders and doing what was right. He chose to save lives, even if it meant facing a court-martial later. "You saved a lot of people that night," Elena continued. "But, you also lost good soldiers." "3 of my best men died in that compound," Jake said, his voice heavy with old grief. "Including my nephew." Elena's expression softened slightly. "Lieutenant Morrison. I remember him. He died saving a group of children who were trapped in the basement. He was a hero." The rain continued to beat against the windows as they sat in silence for a moment, both lost in memories of that terrible night. Finally, Elena reached into her jacket again and pulled out a manila envelope. "There's something you need to know about Silent Thunder," she said, sliding the envelope across the table. "Something that goes far beyond what either of us realized at the time." Jake didn't touch the envelope immediately. "Why now? Why are you coming to me after 5 years?" "Because they're planning to do it again," Elena said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The people who fed you that bad intelligence, who set up that mission to fail. They're moving again, and, this time, the stakes are much higher." "Who are they?" Elena glanced around the empty diner, then leaned forward. "A group within your own government, Admiral. People with security clearances and official positions who have been using military operations to cover their own agenda. Silent Thunder wasn't an intelligence failure. It was deliberate." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. "That's a serious accusation." "Yes, it is. And I have proof." She nodded toward the envelope. "Everything is in there. Financial records, communication intercepts, mission planning documents that were never supposed to exist. It took me 5 years to gather it all, but I finally have enough to expose them." "Why bring this to me? Why not go through official channels?" Elena's laugh was bitter. "Because some of those official channels are compromised. I've already lost 2 contacts who tried to investigate this. One died in a car accident that wasn't an accident. The other committed suicide by jumping off a building, except he was afraid of heights." Jake studied her face, looking for signs of deception or delusion. But Elena Volkov met his gaze steadily, and he saw only grim determination and anger that ran bone deep. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. "I want justice for the people who died that night," she said. "And I want to stop them from doing it again. But I can't do it alone. I need someone with your clearance level, someone who can get this information to the right people." Jake picked up the envelope, feeling its weight. Inside were answers to questions that had haunted him for 5 years. But he also knew that opening it would change everything. There would be no going back to his quiet retirement, no more peaceful evenings in empty diners. "There's something else," Elena said, her voice even quieter now. "Something personal that you need to know." She stood up from the booth and, without warning, began to lift the hem of her sweater. Jake started to protest, but the words died in his throat as he saw what she was revealing. Across her ribcage, carved into her skin in deliberate, precise lines, were scars that spelled out a single word: traitor. "They did this to me after Silent Thunder," she said, her voice completely steady despite the horror she was revealing. "When they realized I had survived and might know too much. This was their way of marking me, of reminding me what happens to people who cross them." Jake stared at the scars, feeling sick. The precision of the cuts, the deliberate cruelty of the message, spoke to a level of malevolence that he had rarely encountered even in his years of fighting the world's worst enemies. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice barely controlled. "The same people who sent your nephew to die in that compound," Elena said, pulling her sweater back down. "The same people who are planning their next operation as we sit here." She sat back down, fixing him with an intense stare. "So I'll ask you again, Admiral. Who are you? Are you the man who changed the mission to save innocent lives, or are you just another officer who follows orders without asking questions?" Jake looked down at the envelope in his hands, then back up at Elena. In her eyes, he saw a reflection of his own choice from 5 years ago. The choice between duty and conscience, between following orders and doing what was right. The rain was beginning to let up outside, and, in the distance, Jake could hear the sound of a car engine approaching. Elena heard it too, and he saw her body tense slightly. "You don't have long to decide," she said. "They've been tracking me for weeks. I led them away from you tonight, but they'll figure out where I've been eventually." "How do I know you're telling the truth?" Jake asked. "How do I know this isn't some elaborate setup?" Elena stood up from the booth and reached for her jacket. "Because, Admiral, you've seen what they're capable of. You've lost people to their games. And, deep down, you've always known that something about Silent Thunder didn't add up." She paused at the edge of the table. "The real question isn't whether I'm telling the truth. The question is whether you're willing to find out. Whether you're willing to honor the memory of your nephew and all the others who died that night." The sound of the car engine was getting closer now, and Elena glanced toward the window. "I have to go. If you decide to open that envelope, there's a phone number inside. Use it within 24 hours, or destroy everything and forget we ever met." She started to walk away, then turned back one more time. "For what it's worth, Admiral, your nephew talked about you a lot during the mission. He said you were the only officer he knew who actually cared more about his people than his career. He would want you to do the right thing." And, with that, she was gone, slipping out the back exit of the diner as quietly as she had arrived. Jake sat alone with the envelope, listening to the rain and thinking about choices that couldn't be undone. Outside, the car engine grew louder, then faded as it passed by the diner. Jake didn't know if it was connected to Elena or just late-night traffic, but her words echoed in his mind. 24 hours to decide. He looked down at the envelope one more time, then carefully tucked it inside his jacket. Whatever was inside, whatever truth Elena Volkov was carrying, it would have to wait until he was somewhere more secure. But, even as he prepared to leave, Jake knew that his quiet retirement was over. The scars on Elena's ribs, the photograph from Silent Thunder, the weight of unanswered questions, it all pointed toward a reckoning that had been 5 years in the making. As he stepped out into the night air, Jake Admiral Morrison began to plan his next move. Somewhere in the darkness, people were counting on him to make the right choice. Including a young Navy SEAL who would never come home, and a woman whose scars told a story that demanded justice. The rain had stopped, but the storm was just beginning. 22 hours had passed since Elena Volkov disappeared into the night, and Admiral Jake Morrison sat in his secure study, staring at the unopened envelope that could change everything. His house was a fortress disguised as a modest coastal cottage, reinforced walls, multiple escape routes, and surveillance systems that would make the Pentagon jealous. Old habits from a lifetime of making enemies. Jake had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elena's scars, heard his nephew's voice from that last radio transmission before everything went dark. The envelope felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, sitting there on his desk next to his service weapon and a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. His secure phone buzzed. Unknown number, but the encryption protocol told him it was military grade. He answered without speaking. Admiral Morrison? The voice was young, nervous. This is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, Naval Intelligence. Sir, we need to talk. It's about Operation Silent Thunder. Jake's blood chilled. Who gave you this number? A mutual friend suggested we meet. Someone who's been dead for 5 years, according to official records. Jake closed his eyes. Elena had moved faster than he expected. Where? The old pier at Marina Bay. 1 hour. Come alone, and, Admiral? Bring that envelope you've been staring at. The line went dead. Jake looked around his study, realizing that if they knew about the envelope, they were watching him. His secure house wasn't as secure as he thought. He opened his gun safe and selected a compact pistol, checking the ammunition with practiced efficiency. Whatever was happening, he wouldn't face it unarmed. The envelope went into a waterproof case, along with copies of documents he'd pulled from his own classified files the night before. The drive to Marina Bay took 30 minutes through winding coastal roads. Jake used the time to think, to prepare for whatever revelation awaited him. Elena Volkov was either the key to exposing a massive conspiracy, or she was the most elaborate honey trap he'd ever encountered. Either way, his nephew's death deserved answers. The pier stretched out into dark water, fog rolling in from the ocean to create perfect cover for a clandestine meeting. Jake parked at the far end of the lot and approached on foot, his hand resting on his concealed weapon. The wood planks creaked under his boots as he walked toward the end of the pier. Lieutenant Commander Chen was younger than her voice suggested, maybe 35, with short black hair and the kind of intense focus that came from working in intelligence. She stood with her back to the water, positioned so she could see anyone approaching. Professional. Admiral, she said as he drew near. Thank you for coming. Where is she? Jake asked without preamble. Safe, for now. But we don't have long before they track her down again. Chen gestured to a bench overlooking the water. We should sit. This is going to take a while. Jake remained standing. Start talking. Chen sighed and pulled out a tablet, swiping to display a photograph of a man in an expensive suit. Do you recognize him? Jake studied the face. Distinguished, silver-haired, the kind of man who looked comfortable in both boardrooms and situation rooms. Deputy Director Marcus Webb, CIA. What about him? He's the one who ordered Elena's torture after Silent Thunder. He's also the one who provided the false intelligence that sent your team into that compound 5 years ago. The fog swirled around them as Chen continued. Webb has been running unauthorized operations for years, using military assets to eliminate obstacles to certain business interests. Silent Thunder was supposed to wipe out a group of witnesses who could testify about war crimes committed by a private military contractor. What witnesses? Jake asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. The refugees in that compound weren't random civilians, Admiral. They were former employees of Blackwater Solutions, a PMC that was hired to secure mining rights in the region. When the company started executing prisoners and targeting hospitals, some of their people grew a conscience. They gathered evidence, recorded conversations, took photographs. Jake felt the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. The safe house was supposed to be their hiding place until they could make contact with international war crimes investigators. But Webb's people found them first. The original mission briefing you received was designed to eliminate the witnesses and destroy the evidence, making it look like a legitimate anti-terrorism operation. But someone changed the parameters, Jake said, remembering his decision that night to protect the civilians instead of following the original orders. You did. And that decision saved not just those people's lives, but also preserved evidence that could bring down an entire network of corruption. Chen swiped to a new image on her tablet. Elena was there as a UN observer, documenting human rights violations. When she realized what was happening, she chose to stay and help protect the witnesses. Jake studied the new image, which showed Elena in civilian clothes, standing next to a group of people he now recognized as some of the refugees they had evacuated. She looked younger, hopeful, nothing like the scarred woman who had confronted him in the diner. After the mission, when Webb realized that both you and Elena had survived and might know too much, he had you monitored and her captured. Chen's voice dropped. The torture wasn't just punishment, Admiral. It was interrogation. They wanted to know how much she had learned, who she had talked to. And the scars? Webb's signature. He likes to mark people who cross him. It's psychological warfare, meant to break their spirit and serve as a warning to others. Jake finally sat down on the bench, feeling the weight of 5 years' worth of guilt and unanswered questions pressing down on him. Why come to me now? Why not take this to the Secretary of Defense or Congress? Chen laughed bitterly. Because Webb has connections everywhere. 3 separate attempts to expose him have failed because information leaked before investigators could act. People died, Admiral. Good people who thought they were doing the right thing. She showed him another photograph, this one of a young Army captain in dress uniform. Captain David Park, Army Intelligence. He discovered financial records linking Webb to the PMC corruption. Died in a training accident that was anything but accidental. The next image was of a middle-aged woman in civilian clothes. Amanda Foster, investigative journalist. She was working on a story about unauthorized military operations. Suicide by overdose, except the toxicology report was classified and the investigating officer transferred to another continent the next day. Jake studied each face, memorizing them. More casualties in a war most people didn't even know was being fought. What's Elena's plan? She's gathered enough evidence to expose the entire network, but she needs someone with your clearance level to verify and authenticate the documents. Someone Webb can't simply eliminate without raising questions. You mean someone visible enough that my death would be noticed? Exactly. An admiral with your service record, your connections, your reputation for integrity. Killing you would require explanations that Webb can't afford to give. Chen put the tablet away and pulled out a different device, this one looking like a military-grade communication unit. Elena wants to meet with you tonight. Just the 2 of you. She'll share everything she's gathered, but only if you agree to see this through to the end. And if I refuse? Then she disappears again, probably forever. And Webb continues his operations until someone else with the courage and resources to stop him comes along. Jake looked out at the dark water, thinking about his nephew, about Elena's scars, about all the people who had died because good soldiers followed bad orders. The fog was getting thicker, making the world feel smaller, more intimate. Where does she want to meet? Chen handed him a slip of paper with an address. It's an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district. Not exactly comfortable, but secure. She'll be there at midnight. How do I know this isn't a trap? How do I know you're really who you say you are? Instead of answering directly, Chen rolled up her left sleeve, revealing a tattoo of an anchor with the words "Death Before Dishonor" underneath. It was the same tattoo Jake's nephew had gotten when he joined the SEALs. Lieutenant Morrison and I served together before he transferred to your unit, she said quietly. He saved my life during a training exercise gone wrong. When he died in Silent Thunder, I requested transfer to intelligence specifically to investigate what happened. Jake stared at the tattoo, remembering how proud his nephew had been when he got it. The kid had been so young, so eager to serve, so certain that he was fighting for something that mattered. He talked about you constantly, Chen continued. Said his uncle was the kind of officer who would always choose his people over his career. He believed that right up until the end. The fog swirled around them as Jake made his decision. Tell Elena I'll be there. Chen nodded and stood to leave, then paused. Admiral, there's something else you should know. Webb isn't just planning another operation. He's planning several. And, this time, the targets include American civilians. What kind of targets? Whistleblowers, journalists, former military personnel who might have knowledge of his activities. Elena has a list, and your name is on it. Jake felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. He had been living on borrowed time without even knowing it. How long? Days, maybe hours. The only reason you're still alive is because they're trying to figure out what Elena told you and whether you shared it with anyone else. And if they decide I'm too dangerous? Chen's expression was grim. Then, this conversation becomes academic. She walked away, her footsteps quickly swallowed by the fog. Jake sat alone on the pier for another 20 minutes, thinking about choices and consequences, about the difference between following orders and following conscience. When he finally stood to leave, he noticed a car that hadn't been in the parking lot when he arrived. Dark sedan, government plates, 2 figures in the front seat. They made no attempt to hide their presence, which meant they wanted him to know he was being watched. Jake walked to his truck with measured steps, neither hurrying nor dawdling. The watchers could follow him home if they wanted. They would find an empty house and a well-prepared defensive position. He had survived too many dangerous situations to be intimidated by a surveillance team. But, as he drove through the winding coastal roads, Jake found himself thinking about Elena's scars again. The deliberate cruelty, the calculated humiliation. What kind of person carved words into another human being? What kind of system protected and enabled such monsters? His secure phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Trust no one. They know about tonight. Change the location. Jake pulled over at a scenic overlook and considered his options. If Elena was right, then the warehouse meeting was compromised. Webb's people would be waiting there, ready to eliminate both of them and solve multiple problems at once. He thought about the slip of paper Chen had given him, wondering if the young intelligence officer was really who she claimed to be, or if she was part of an elaborate deception. The tattoo had seemed genuine, but tattoos could be faked. Another text arrived. Remember the place where your nephew learned to swim? 1 hour after midnight. Jake smiled grimly. Elena had done her homework. His nephew had spent summers at Jake's cabin on Lake Morrison, a remote property that had been in the family for generations. If Elena knew about that, then she had access to very detailed personal information. Either that, or... His phone rang. Unknown number again, but this time he recognized the encryption signature. Uncle Jake? The voice was weak, distorted, but unmistakably familiar. Jake's heart stopped. Tommy? They have me, Uncle Jake. They want to trade. The lake house. Come alone, or they'll finish what they started 5 years ago. The line went dead. Jake stared at the phone, his mind racing. His nephew was dead. He had been at the funeral, had helped carry the casket. But, the voice on the phone. Another text from Elena's number. It's a lie. Your nephew is dead. They're using voice synthesis technology. Don't go to the lake house. Jake's hands were shaking as he started the truck. Voice synthesis had advanced dramatically in recent years. With enough recorded samples, it was possible to create convincing fake audio of anyone saying anything. And Webb's people would have access to the most sophisticated technology available. But what if it wasn't fake? What if somehow, impossibly, his nephew had survived? What if the past 5 years had been built on a lie? Jake drove toward his cabin, knowing it was probably a trap, but unable to ignore the possibility that family might still be alive. The roads grew narrower and more winding as he climbed into the mountains, his headlights cutting through fog that seemed to grow thicker with every mile. 20 minutes from the lake house, his phone buzzed one more time. A message from Elena's number, but this one was different, a photograph that made his blood run cold. It showed a man who looked exactly like his nephew, but 5 years older, sitting tied to a chair in what appeared to be a basement or warehouse. Above him, barely visible in the shadows, stood a figure in military fatigues holding a pistol. At the bottom of the image, a single line of text, real or fake? Only one way to find out. Jake pressed the accelerator harder, racing through the mountain darkness toward a confrontation that would either reunite him with family he thought he had lost, or deliver him into the hands of enemies who had been planning this moment for 5 years. Behind him, in the rearview mirror, he caught glimpses of headlights that had been following him since the pier. Webb's people were making their move, and Jake was driving straight into their web. But, as the lake house came into view through the trees, Jake realized that he had been preparing for this moment his entire career. Every mission, every difficult decision, every time he had chosen to protect others instead of protecting himself, it had all led to this night. The fog was so thick now that he could barely see 10 feet ahead of his headlights. Somewhere in that darkness, answers waited. Along with Elena Volkov, the woman whose scars held the key to everything, and possibly a nephew who should have been dead but might still be fighting for his life. Jake checked his weapon one more time and drove toward whatever truth awaited him at the water's edge. The lake house sat in absolute darkness, its familiar silhouette barely visible through the thick fog that had followed Jake into the mountains. He parked 50 yards away and approached on foot, every sense heightened by years of combat training and the growing certainty that this was where everything would either end or begin. The cabin had been his sanctuary for decades, a place where he came to fish, to think, to escape the weight of command decisions that sent young men and women into harm's way. Now it felt like walking into a tomb. Jake circled the building once, noting the signs of recent occupation, fresh tire tracks in the mud, a window that had been forced open and hastily secured. His thermal scope revealed at least 3 heat signatures inside, 2 moving around the main room, 1 stationary in what appeared to be the basement. His heart hammered against his ribs. The stationary figure was the right size and shape to be his nephew. But Elena's warning echoed in his mind: voice synthesis, digital manipulation, the kind of psychological warfare that could break even the strongest minds. A stick cracked behind him. Jake spun, weapon drawn, to find Elena Volkov emerging from the tree line. She moved like a ghost, silent and controlled, her dark clothing making her nearly invisible in the fog. "You came," she said quietly. "So did they," Jake replied, gesturing toward the cabin. 3 hostiles inside, 1 prisoner in the basement. Elena nodded. "I counted the same. Plus 2 vehicles hidden in the woods on the far side of the lake, probably backup teams." "Is he really alive?" Jake asked, the question that had been tearing at him for the past hour. Elena's expression was unreadable in the darkness. "I don't know. But, Admiral, even if he is, this is still a trap. They're counting on your emotional response to cloud your judgment." "Then, why are you here?" "Because sometimes the only way to spring a trap is to walk into it with your eyes wide open." Elena checked her own weapon, a compact submachine gun that looked military issue. "I've spent 5 years planning for this moment. Webb thinks he's in control, but he's about to learn what happens when you underestimate your enemies." Jake studied her face in the dim light. The scars were hidden beneath her tactical gear, but he could see the determination that had kept her alive through 5 years of running and hiding. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was personal. "What's the plan?" he asked. Elena pulled out a small device that looked like a military communication unit. "In 30 seconds, I'm going to trigger a localized EMP burst that will knock out their electronics, radios, night vision, surveillance equipment. We'll have maybe 5 minutes before their backup systems come online. And then? Then, we go in hard and fast. You take the main floor, I'll clear the basement and secure the prisoner. If it really is your nephew, we extract him. If it's not." She let the implication hang in the air. Jake nodded, checking his weapon one more time. "What about Webb's backup teams?" "Leave them to me. I've been mapping their positions for the past hour. They won't be a problem." Elena held up the device, her finger hovering over the activation switch. "Are you ready for this, Admiral? Once we go through that door, there's no going back." Jake thought about his nephew, about the young man who had looked up to him, who had joined the SEALs to follow in his footsteps. About Elena's scars and all the people who had died because corrupt officials played games with soldiers' lives. "I'm ready." Elena triggered the device. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, from inside the cabin, came the sound of confused voices and equipment shutting down. The soft glow from the windows disappeared as electronic systems failed. Now, Elena whispered. They moved together, covering each other as they approached the front door. Jake could hear movement inside, people stumbling around in the sudden darkness. He kicked the door open and rolled inside, Elena covering his advance. The main room was chaos. Two men in tactical gear were fumbling with dead night vision equipment, trying to establish radio contact with backup that couldn't hear them. Jake recognized them immediately as military contractors, the kind of mercenaries that Webb favored for operations that needed to stay off the official books. Navy SEALs. Drop your weapons. Jake shouted. The contractors spun toward his voice, raising their rifles. Jake's training took over, muscle memory from 1,000 combat situations guiding his movements. He fired twice, center mass, dropping the first man instantly. The second contractor managed to get off a wild shot that splintered wood near Jake's head before Elena's precise burst cut him down. Silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the sound of their own breathing. Elena was already moving toward the basement stairs, her weapon raised and ready. Contact, she called softly. One hostile, armed. Jake heard the brief exchange of gunfire from below, 3 quick shots followed by a heavy thud. Then, Elena's voice, tight with emotion, "Admiral, you need to see this." Jake descended into the basement, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. What he found there made his knees weak and his hands shake with rage. The man tied to the chair was indeed his nephew, or someone who looked exactly like him. But this wasn't the young, eager SEAL who had died 5 years ago. This was a broken shell of a human being, scarred and thin, his eyes holding a hollow emptiness that spoke of years of captivity and torture. "Tommy?" Jake whispered. The man's head lifted slowly, and, when their eyes met, Jake saw recognition flicker there. But it was the recognition of a stranger, not the warm familiarity of family. "They told me you would come," the man said, his voice a raspy whisper. "They said you were the uncle. But I don't. I can't remember." Elena knelt beside the chair, carefully cutting the bonds. "He's been drugged, probably for years. Memory suppression compounds, psychological conditioning. They've been using him as their ace in the hole, saving him for the moment when they needed to control you." Jake felt something break inside his chest. His nephew, if this really was his nephew, had been alive all this time, suffering, being used as a weapon against his own family. The rage that filled him was white-hot and completely focused. "Where is Webb?" he asked, his voice deadly calm. Elena stood, checking the unconscious contractor she had taken down. "According to the intelligence I've gathered, he has a safe house about 30 miles from here." "But, Admiral, we need to move. My EMP won't keep his backup teams down forever." The man in the chair, Jake still couldn't bring himself to think of him as Tommy, looked up with confusion in his eyes. They said you would take me home. But, I don't remember home. I don't remember anything except the room and the needles and the voices telling me what to think." Jake knelt in front of him, studying the face that was so familiar yet so changed. Scars marked his skin, some surgical, others clearly from beatings. His hands showed signs of prolonged restraint, and there was a vacant quality to his expression that spoke of mind-altering drugs. "What did they do to you?" Jake asked softly. "Made me forget," the man replied. "Made me into someone else. But, sometimes, in dreams, I see water. I see a man teaching me to cast a fishing line. Is that you?" Jake's throat tightened. He had taught his nephew to fish at this very lake, spending countless summer hours on the dock, talking about everything and nothing. If this man remembered that, if some part of the real Tommy still existed inside the programming. "We need to go," Elena said urgently. "I'm picking up radio chatter." "They're regrouping." Jake helped the man to his feet, noting how he moved, still with some of the muscle memory of a trained soldier, but hesitant, unsure. "Can you walk?" "I think so. They made me exercise, made me stay strong." said I might be needed for missions. The three of them climbed out of the basement and moved toward the back exit. Jake could see vehicle lights in the distance, Webb's backup teams closing in on their position. Elena led them through a hidden path that wound toward the lake shore, where she had a boat waiting. "This is the extraction route I prepared years ago," she explained as they made their way through the dark woods. "It leads to a safe house where we can figure out our next move." "What about Webb?" Jake asked. "He'll be expecting us to run, to disappear like we did 5 years ago. Instead, we're going to do something he won't expect." "Which is?" Elena smiled grimly. "We're going to attack." They reached the boat just as the first search teams appeared near the cabin. Elena started the silent electric motor and guided them across the dark water, using GPS navigation since visual landmarks were invisible in the fog. The man who might be Jake's nephew sat silently in the bow, staring out at water he couldn't see. Occasionally, he would touch his temple as if in pain, fighting against whatever mental programming had been forced on him. "The memories," he said suddenly. "They're trying to come back, but there's something blocking them. Like a wall in my head." Elena glanced back at him. "That's the conditioning. They've been using a combination of drugs and psychological manipulation to suppress your natural memories and replace them with manufactured ones. It's reversible, but it takes time." "How much time? For someone who's been under that kind of control for 5 years?" "Months, maybe longer. And there's no guarantee that everything will come back." Jake felt another stab of rage at what had been done to his family. Webb hadn't just faked his nephew's death, he had stolen his mind, his identity, his very sense of self. The boat reached the far shore, where Elena had hidden another vehicle. As they transferred from water to land, Jake's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Unknown number, but he answered anyway. "Admiral Morrison," came Webb's smooth, cultured voice. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "The only thing you're going to get from me is a reckoning," Jake replied. Webb laughed. "Oh, I don't think so. You see, your nephew, and he really is your nephew, by the way, has been very carefully programmed for the past 5 years. Specific trigger phrases, behavioral conditioning, implanted suggestions. Would you like to see what happens when I activate them?" "Don't listen to him," Elena whispered urgently. But Webb was already speaking again, his voice carrying clearly over the phone connection. "Subject 7, this is Control. Authorization Omega Black 7. Mission parameters are now active." The man beside Jake suddenly went rigid, his entire body tensing as if he had received an electric shock. When he turned to look at Jake, his eyes held a completely different expression, cold, calculating, predatory. "Target acquired," he said in a voice completely devoid of emotion. Jake saw the knife appear in his nephew's hand as if by magic, the blade reflecting what little light penetrated the fog. Professional grip, perfect stance, the movements of someone who had been trained to kill efficiently and without hesitation. Elena raised her weapon, but Jake caught her arm. "No. He's not in control of himself. Admiral, he's been programmed to kill you. Webb's activated a sleeper protocol." The programmed assassin who wore his nephew's face began to advance, the knife held low and ready. Jake could see the internal struggle playing out in his expression, flickers of confusion and pain fighting against the artificial commands that drove him forward. "Tommy," Jake said softly. "Remember the lake. Remember learning to fish. Remember that summer when you caught your first bass and we cooked it over the campfire." The advance faltered for a moment, and something human showed through the programming. But then, Webb's voice came again over the phone speaker, reinforcing the commands, and the killer instincts took over once more. Jake had to choose, fight back against the nephew he had thought dead for 5 years, or allow himself to be killed by the family he had failed to protect. Behind them, vehicle engines roared to life as Webb's teams closed in. Ahead, a programmed killer advanced with mechanical precision. And, in the fog that surrounded them all, Jake realized that the real battle for his nephew's soul was just beginning. Elena's finger tightened on her trigger. "Admiral, I can end this." "No," Jake said firmly. "There's another way." He dropped his weapon and spread his arms wide, making himself completely vulnerable. Tommy, if you're going to do this, look at me. Really look at me. Remember who I am. Remember who you are. The knife came up, ready to strike. But, in the depths of those programmed eyes, Jake saw something flicker, a spark of recognition, a fragment of memory fighting its way through years of conditioning. The fishing line, his nephew whispered, his voice torn between mechanical obedience and human emotion. You taught me to cast. Webb's voice crackled over the phone, desperate now. Subject 7, complete the mission. Kill the target. But, the knife wavered, and Jake saw tears beginning to form in his nephew's eyes. The battle for Tommy Morrison's mind was far from over, but, for the first time in 5 years, hope had entered the fight. The knife trembled in Tommy's hand as two realities warred within his mind. Jake could see the struggle playing out in his nephew's eyes, mechanical programming fighting against buried memories, artificial commands battling natural love. The fish, Tommy whispered, his voice cracking. It was a base. My first base. You said I was a natural. Webb's voice screamed through the phone speaker. Subject 7, execute the mission. Kill the primary target. But, something had broken in the programming. Tommy's face contorted in pain as he fought against 5 years of conditioning, the knife still raised but no longer moving forward. Elena kept her weapon trained on him, her expression torn between compassion and tactical necessity. Admiral, we have maybe 30 seconds before Webb's teams reach us. Jake never took his eyes off his nephew. Tommy, remember what I told you that day at the lake? About being a Morrison. About what that means. I can't. Tommy's face was streaming with tears now. There are voices. Commands. They're so loud. Morrisons protect people, Jake continued, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. We don't hurt family. We don't abandon each other. That's who you are, not what they made you into. The knife clattered to the ground as Tommy collapsed to his knees, hands pressed against his temples. Get them out. Get the voices out of my head. Elena grabbed Jake's arm. We have to move. Now. Vehicle lights were approaching fast through the fog, and Jake could hear the sound of boots on wet ground. Webb's teams had found their position. Elena led them toward a rocky outcropping that offered some cover, half-carrying Tommy who was still fighting his internal battle. They reached the rocks just as the first muzzle flashes lit up the night. Elena returned fire with controlled bursts while Jake helped his nephew find cover. Tommy was still disoriented, but his military training was beginning to override the psychological programming. How many? Tommy asked, his voice clearer now. 8, maybe 10, Elena replied between shots. Professional contractors, well-equipped. Tommy picked up the knife he had dropped, his grip sure and competent despite the confusion in his eyes. What do you need me to do? Jake felt a surge of pride. Whatever they had done to his nephew's mind, they hadn't been able to completely erase the soldier beneath. Can you handle a weapon? I think so. The muscle memory is still there. Elena tossed him a backup pistol. They're flanking us from the left. Can you cover that approach? Tommy nodded and moved into position with fluid professionalism. When the first contractor appeared through the fog, Tommy's shot was precise and lethal. The programming might have been breaking down, but his combat skills remained intact. Good shooting, Jake said. It feels familiar, Tommy replied, confusion still evident in his voice. Like remembering a dream. The firefight continued for several minutes, with Webb's team trying to close the distance while Elena's group held them off from cover. But they were outnumbered and would eventually be overwhelmed. We need an exit strategy, Elena called out during a brief lull in the shooting. Jake's phone rang again. Webb's number. Admiral, this is becoming quite tedious. Webb's voice was calm and controlled despite the gunfire in the background. I have a proposition for you. I'm listening. Surrender now, and I'll make your deaths quick. Continue to resist, and I'll activate the failsafe protocol I had installed in your nephew's programming. Would you like to know what that entails? Jake felt ice in his veins. Tell me. If he doesn't receive a specific chemical suppressor every 72 hours, his brain will essentially shut down. Massive seizures, organ failure, death within minutes. He's been on that leash for 5 years, Admiral. Even if you escape tonight, he's living on borrowed time. Tommy looked over at Jake, understanding flickering in his eyes. He's telling the truth, isn't he? I remember now, the injections. Every 3 days. They said it was vitamins. Elena's face was grim. Biochemical control. I've seen it before. It's real, and it's lethal. So you see, Webb continued over the phone, you can't really win this. Even if you kill everyone I've sent after you, even if you expose my operations, your nephew will die anyway. Unless, of course, you're willing to negotiate. Jake felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. Save his nephew and let Webb continue his reign of terror, or stop Webb and watch the last of his family die from chemical poisoning. What do you want? Jake asked. Simple. You and Ms. Volkov surrender. I get the evidence she's gathered, along with any copies you might have made. In exchange, I'll provide your nephew with the suppressor drugs he needs and allow all 3 of you to live quietly somewhere remote. Under your control. Naturally. But alive, which is more than you'll be if you continue this futile resistance. Tommy crawled over to where Jake crouched behind the rocks. Uncle Jake, don't do it. I'm already dead, have been for 5 years. Don't let him use me to control you. You're not dead, Jake said firmly. And I'm not losing you again. Elena was monitoring the enemy positions while listening to the conversation. Admiral, I might have another option. But it's extremely risky. What is it? The suppressor drug Webb is using, I've seen the formula. It's designed to create dependency, but the underlying chemistry is actually quite simple. If we can get to a proper lab, I might be able to synthesize an antidote. Might? 60% chance of success. Maybe 70 if we can get a sample of the original compound for analysis. Tommy managed a weak smile. Better odds than we usually get in this business. Jake made his decision. Webb, here's my counteroffer. Go to hell. He hung up the phone and immediately heard orders being shouted in the distance. The shooting resumed with renewed intensity as Webb's teams received orders to take them dead rather than alive. Elena, how long to get to a lab? Jake asked while returning fire. There's a research facility about 50 miles from here. Dr. Sarah Kim, she's a biochemist who owes me a favor from Afghanistan. But we have to get there, and we have to bring a sample of Tommy's blood for testing. A new sound cut through the gunfire, helicopter rotors approaching fast. Jake looked up to see a military transport chopper emerging from the fog, its spotlight sweeping the ground below. That's either very bad news or very good news, Elena said. The helicopter's loudspeaker crackled to life. This is Colonel Marcus Reed, U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Division. Webb's teams are ordered to stand down immediately and surrender their weapons. The gunfire from Webb's contractors ceased abruptly. Through the fog, Jake could see figures emerging with their hands raised as Army CID agents moved in to arrest them. Elena was grinning. Very good news. I've been feeding intelligence to Colonel Reed for months, building a case against Webb. Looks like he finally got enough evidence to move. The helicopter landed nearby, and Jake recognized the tall, stern figure who climbed out. Colonel Reed had a reputation for being absolutely incorruptible, the kind of officer who would take on anyone regardless of rank or connections if they violated military law. Admiral Morrison, Reed called out as he approached their position. We need to talk. Jake emerged from cover, helping Tommy to his feet. His nephew was still weak and confused, but he was standing on his own. Colonel, I hope you brought a medical team. Among other things. We've been tracking Webb's operation for months, thanks to intelligence provided by Ms. Volkov. Reed gestured to Elena. She's been working with us as an unofficial asset while building her own case. Jake turned to Elena with surprise. You've been working with CID this whole time? Not exactly. I've been feeding them information while pursuing my own investigation. But, when I learned about tonight's trap, I realized we needed official backup. Reed was examining Tommy with a professional eye. This is the nephew who was supposedly killed in Silent Thunder. Apparently reports of my death were greatly exaggerated, Tommy said weakly. Though I'm not entirely sure I'm alive either. We need to get him to a medical facility immediately, Jake said. There are drugs in his system that need to be counteracted. Reed nodded. Already arranged. We have a team standing by at Walter Reed with experience in chemical deprogramming. But, first, I need to know, do you have the evidence against Webb? Elena pulled out a waterproof case from her gear. Everything's here. Financial records, communications intercepts, mission documents, testimony from survivors. Enough to put Webb away for several lifetimes. Where is Webb now? Jake asked. In custody, Reed replied. We picked him up an hour ago at his safe house. He was so focused on this operation that he didn't notice CID agents surrounding his location. Tommy swayed slightly, and Jake caught his arm to steady him. How long do we have before the chemical dependency becomes critical? Based on what our medical team has analyzed, probably 18 to 20 hours, Reed said. But, we've already begun synthesizing a treatment protocol. Dr. Kim at the research facility has been working on it since MS. Volkov provided the initial intelligence. Jake felt a weight lifting from his shoulders for the first time in years. So it's over? Webb is finished. Reed's expression was cautious. Webb is finished, but his network runs deep. There are others involved, other operations that we're still investigating. This is the beginning, not the end. Elena nodded. Webb was just one node in a larger conspiracy. But, without his protection and resources, the rest will be easier to root out. Tommy looked around at the fog-shrouded landscape, his eyes clearing slightly. I'm starting to remember things. Not everything, but pieces. This place. I used to come here as a kid. Every summer, Jake confirmed. You loved the fishing, hated the hiking. The hiking, Tommy laughed weakly. Yeah, that sounds right. As the CID teams finished processing the scene and loading Webb's captured contractors into transport vehicles, Jake found himself looking at his nephew with a mixture of grief and hope. The young man who had died in Silent Thunder was gone, probably forever. But, the person who had survived 5 years of hell and programming was still family, still worth saving. Elena joined them as they prepared to board the medical helicopter. There's something I need to tell you both. About the scars Webb gave me. She pulled up her shirt again, revealing the carved word across her ribs. But, in the helicopter's bright interior lights, Jake could see something he had missed in the diner's dim illumination. The scars weren't just random cuts, they formed letters, but not the word he had thought. What does it really say? Jake asked. Elena smiled sadly. Survivor. Webb thought he was marking me as a traitor, but his Russian wasn't as good as he thought. The word he carved actually means survivor. It's been my reminder for 5 years that no matter what he did to me, I was still here, still fighting. Tommy studied the scars with growing clarity. He marked you too. Different method, same intention. Break our spirits, make us his. But, we survived, Elena said. All of us. And, now we're going to make sure he pays for what he did. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying them toward medical treatment and the long process of healing, Jake looked down at the lake house disappearing into the fog below. So many secrets had been buried there, so much pain and deception. But, also hope. His nephew was alive, damaged but recoverable. Elena had found justice for her scars and the people who had died. Webb's network would be dismantled piece by piece. The war wasn't over, there would be more investigations, more trials, more dangerous people to stop. But, for the first time in 5 years, Jake felt like they were winning. Tommy dozed fitfully against his shoulder as the helicopter flew through the night sky, his breathing steady and his color improving as the medical team administered preliminary treatment. The programming was breaking down, the chemical dependency could be treated, and, somewhere beneath the artificial conditioning, the real person was beginning to emerge. Elena sat across from them, finally, allowing herself to rest after years of running and hiding. The evidence case sat securely at her feet, containing the proof that would bring down not just Webb but dozens of others who had turned military service into personal profit. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Jake Morrison allowed himself to believe that justice was possible, that redemption could follow betrayal, and that family bonds could survive even the worst that evil men could devise. The scars would remain, on Elena's body, in Tommy's mind, in Jake's heart. But scars were proof of survival, evidence that they had endured and overcome. And, in the end, that was enough. The helicopter flew on toward healing, toward justice, toward a future that finally held more promise than pain.